Penny was born and grew up here in Lincoln. She went to Wellesley, where she received her bachelor's degree in 1974. She then took what she termed a circuitous path toward becoming an ordained minister in the Liberal United Church of Christ, graduating from Harvard Divinity School in 1980. She served 16 churches in 7 states in the past 40 years before returning to Lincoln in 2010. She is currently the interim pastor of the Northeast United Church of Christ here in Lincoln, the type of role that she has usually served. But that's not all she's done. She is also a self-proclaimed lover of science, and in 2006 received a bachelor's degree in geology from the University of Southern Indiana. There, she published research and won an award for the interpretation of an outcrop, a visible exposure of bedrock and other geologic formations at the Earth's surface that had experienced several cycles of climate change over the 4 million years of its deposition. In 2007, she began to study the weather-making portion of our atmosphere, some 6.5 miles above us, through classes in climate and meteorology, primarily here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. She has worked in a research lab studying extreme precipitation, attribution science, heat waves, and most recently, the science of climate change communication. She is a passionate climate educator and a legislative advocate, primarily through the nonprofit Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light, where she has been the board chair for the past 6 years. As if all of that isn't enough, she also identifies as a news junkie and a lover of all sorts of music, and says she was delighted by our recent snowstorm. Please welcome Penny Greer and her paper, A Tragedy of Avoidance.
Thank you, Tim. It's truly wonderful to be here tonight to welcome so many friends, with several I know can help us start a great discussion if we don't do that ourselves. I must begin by confessing that I'm breaking the rules of our great club, that when we would give a paper, it would not be within our field of expertise, that rather we would be stretched and challenged to learn and present something new, and that the title of our talk would belie its actual focus. The first time I came to Torch, I heard a paper delivered by Denise Bulling entitled A Sea of Red. Now, before I arrived, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, is someone going to talk about the Cornhusker football team again? I mean, what is the Sea of Red? Well, maybe they're going to talk about how we became a Husker nation, the anthropological reality or cultural reality that could be rather interesting. No, A Sea of Red was about the Red Cross. Do you remember the paper? No, well, I do. Denise does. And some scandals that they'd had and how they'd adjusted, and I'm sure a lot of other details as well, but I loved it. All of us were totally fooled. Well, A Tragedy of Avoidance is directly in my field of expertise. And thanks to my primary UNL mentor, Francisco Munoz Areola, I've committed myself to becoming a climate science communicator. And tonight will be a preview of what has been happening to that enterprise. And so, thank you to Mark. We begin with some slides, some science concepts. Senator Haar is the first one, if we have it. It's going to get there. Okay, yeah, we can go to the next slide. These are all photographs taken by a good friend of mine who's a meteorology concentrator at the university, who's now the broadcast meteorologist at the NBC affiliate in North Platte, which is great. Senator Ken Haar is someone that many of us know in our state. He was a seminal figure in helping our university to finally get the funding to finally analyze climate change in Nebraska. And I know that Les actually brought the book tonight, which she can hold up, which is the record of that incredible event. Senator Hart introduced lots of legislation, and now he is a climate educator going all over the state. And he always begins his talks in this manner. It's real. It's us. It's bad. There's hope. And that's how he begins his talks. He's on target. So next slide. Being the climate science person that I am, that I love to talk about, few slides will help us along. Climate is not the same as weather. And this is one of the best illustrations that actually Deb Batke came up with. Was a meteorology professor who now works at the Drought Mitigation Center. Weather is what you wear in a particular day. And as we know, but if we watch the weather forecast, we can now get it for 2 or 3 or 4 days and even out for another week to 10 days. Even with some of the apps we have every hour, and sometimes it's pretty accurate. Climate is more like our wardrobe. And climate really is 3 things. First of all, it is always a larger data set. So when you hear people talking about the weather as though it were the climate, that's not quite right. Climate must involve quite a bit of data. We'd love to have 10 years, 30 years. When I first started the work, Francisco asked me to look for 100 years of data if I could find it, as much as we can get. Climate also refers to the kind of patterns of weather that a place on the earth actually has. We call that its climatology. But climate has an even bigger, more powerful meaning. Next slide. Climate is a complex system. It's not alone. We now know that the human body, indeed the brain, insect colonies, the global economy, produce complex and adaptive behavior from a small number of initial starting rules. A mechanical gas-powered car is complicated, but its basic parts don't change or evolve. The carburetor remains the carburetor, the pistons. In a complex system, the physics is there and remains basic, but the parts can change in intricate relational ways, creating what is called emergent behavior. As an example, climate scientists and meteorologists are actively exploring whether the jet stream's wobbling may be an initial component influencing highs to remain stationary longer in the atmosphere, inducing longer, more damaging heat waves. Those are big sets of connections. We can't quite pinpoint it yet, but it's the kind of new sets of emergent behavior that we would expect from a complex system. So next slide. What actually causes the warming? This is a great slide that I've used many times, and perhaps you've seen it before. The sun shines with all of its different wavelengths on the earth. If where the wavelengths strike the earth is white, covered with snow or ice, or of a lighter color, those wavelengths go back into the atmosphere. They're not absorbed by the earth or the clouds or the greenhouse gases above them. But when the earth has a darker surface, those wavelengths are absorbed by the earth, and they are then transformed to become a different wavelength. And that more often happens at night. Long wave radiation is perfectly made to intersect like a bullseye with water, the most prominent greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, methane, and an increasing number of other gases that are there in much smaller numbers, but are even better absorbers. So sometimes when I've given a sermon, I'm rather crazy. Some of you know that about me. I pretend to be a carbon dioxide molecule, okay? Here's the carbon, there are the 2 oxygens, they're kind of down, polar like that. The other 2 bonding spots aren't taken. Sorry, Les, you'll have to help us understand why, because I never have understood how it could be stable. But anyway, there it is. And it's getting the long wave radiation, and it's vibrating. It's a perfect match. So it touches its neighbors and begins to send energy around it. And that energy ends up going back towards the earth. Some of it may go up to the atmosphere and escape, but most of it doesn't. Hey, we wouldn't be a planet supporting life without this. Thank goodness it's been there. But now we have too much. The water vapor changes phase, as we all know, liquid to ice. But the carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere. Some say 200 years. I've seen 400 years. I've seen 1,000 years. I don't know. I'm not an atmospheric chemist. I do not know. Methane doesn't last as long, but it devolves into carbon dioxide. So the more of those greenhouse gases are there, the more we're going to be receiving that long wave radiation. And as a good scientist wrote, let's look at what's happening in the Arctic. The loss of Arctic ice is a particular concern. The ice is disappearing quite fast. Not only is it snow and ice decreasing, but the loss triggers a positive feedback. By exposing the ocean surface to sunlight, the water warms up. This melts the ice from underneath, while human-made carbon dioxide in the atmosphere warms the surface. Humidity also increases. More ice therefore melts, which exposes more water. It's a positive feedback effect, a loop. It goes around and continues. Next slide. So, has this ever happened before? Certainly. The Earth is 4.55 billion years old, and we know that because of the way radioactive isotopes work. Those are facts that have been going on since the Earth was formed. We have had hothouse climates at other times, at least 4 times in Earth's history that we know about. For example, when the dinosaurs were walking around, it actually wasn't 250 million years ago. It's more recent, from 90 to 120. That was a hothouse climate. But what was going on? Well, there was 5 times the amount of carbon dioxide concentration, which we now have, which is about 419.46. I looked it up today, parts per million. Well, but the majority of North America, Europe, and Asia were tropical rainforests. That's not what we have right now, and most of us would prefer not to have that. 55 million years ago, at the end of the Paleocene epoch, the Earth very rapidly warmed, producing a carbon dioxide concentration, we believe, at about 1900 parts per million, with temperatures rising 5 to 8 degrees. We're not talking about that yet. That's incredible. But the process to get there took about 200,000 years. There were 8 thermals. I did a big research paper on this some years back when I was still in the geology world. We're not quite at the same place. Next slide. The rate of change right now in greenhouse gases, not including water, is accelerating at an unprecedented rate in Earth's history. The carbon dioxide present is more than any time in the past 800,000 years, and probably higher than any time in the past 30 million years. That's the Oligocene, if any of us are into geology. And there were no humans. Now there are. And there's human civilization. And there's all kinds of relationships with the natural world. We're trying so hard to not enable this current extinction event underway to continue. It's a tough time. Moving on. So, how bad might it get? Next slide. Before I say that, this is a wonderful image that Mike Hayes, some of you know Mike, taught us all in one of the climate classes that I took at the School of Natural Resources. The best way to think about how climate change works with the Earth and or the weather is to think of it as like a baseball player on steroids. For those of us who love baseball, Martha and I do, every time someone stands up to bat, hey, they could strike out. They could walk. They could just make a hit. But the chances are, I'm thinking of Mark McGuire, right, guys? You remember Mark McGuire. Mark McGuire hit a lot of home runs, and we sadly found out at the end of the season he was on steroids. The chances are greater he's going to get a home run. So not every weather event are we easily going to see the signature of the warming climate. But one of my potential interests as a citizen scientist is to understand that connection as it's formed more closely, event by event, not just with extreme events, which we've been studying for about 20 years, but the actual events of daily weather. Next. So how bad could it get? This is a statement none of us want to see or read or even think about. I'm sure you've all heard of the book, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, who now serves as a columnist for the New York Times. This is the beginning of the book. With 4 degrees centigrade of warming toward the end of 2100, whole regions of Africa, Australia, the United States, parts of South America, north of Patagonia, and Asia, south of Siberia, good heavens, what if Asia's then left, would be rendered uninhabitable because of direct heat, and I added humidity, because the deal with heat, as I just learned in Rachel's class, is if someone or a population is not accustomed to heat, it will be very harmful to health. But if for anyone on the planet, mammals, humans, perhaps plants as well, if the humidity is very high with heat, we can't sweat and we can't survive. Seriously. So also desertification and flooding. Certainly, regardless if it's uninhabitable, would make them all more inhospitable. Most of us don't even want to think about this. I sat with Les and a group of others from Nebraska Citizens for Science, a group that is a wonderful group, a little smaller than the Torch. And all of them had gone, or a number of them had gone to hear a speaker with the Ian Thompson Forum. Perhaps some of you also were present. She was someone from the Harvard School of Design, and supposedly she gave a 2-hour talk, which I promise I won't, which killed people per se. But she also talked about how terrible it was, how much destruction there would be with the warming of the climate. And it was just so depressing. We just didn't want to hear it. So that's our attitude. We don't want to hear this. Really? That's too tough. Next slide. Well, there is some good news, and we need to dwell on that. Next slide. There was a great article in the Washington Post that maybe some of you saw, January 6th. Because of the accelerating solar and wind energy adoption, it means that global warming probably will not reach the extremes that were once feared. That's really good news. However, it means it's got to work. There are 4 bills coming up to the unicameral this week. We could all make phone calls, or at this point, do a quick email. Don't pass the 2 that make it so hard for solar energy installations to get started. Do pass the bill that will forbid homeowner associations from forbidding solar arrays. And I can't think of the 4th one offhand. There are lots of bills. Some of us just worked on one about farming last week, but these directly have to do with the climate. So as I heard Mark Skolnick give a talk to a whole bunch of churches recently, LAS has put out a very ambitious goal that we're going to get to net zero carbon by, help me, Edison, 2040? Or is it 35? One of the two. I think it's 40. He said, we can't get there without you. We need all of you churches, all of the institutions in this city, individuals, to start cutting back and holding our feet to the fire. So there's good news if we can pull it off. Next. Another piece of good news. Some of you may know about the Yale program on climate change communication. They talk about 6 Americas, a very interesting set of categories having to do with how people respond to climate change. Alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive. Here's the good news. Next slide. The alarmed segment has nearly doubled in size. 18 to 33% in only 3 or 4 years. And here's an even better piece of news. It's gone up 9 percentage points from March to September of 2021. And that was during the pandemic, when we might not have even been thinking about the climate. The dismissive category, which is the last one, has decreased from 11 to 9%. And that's 1 in 10 Americans. Now you might say, well, how the heck did they know all that? I began some research last semester by realizing they do tremendous levels of surveying all over the country. They actually have readouts for every county. I know how you can get data in climate world when you don't have a weather station in every corner. I'm not sure how they can do it, but they do have tremendous amounts of data. So they really do keep track of lots of parts of our country. So this is really good news. And again, the same comment that was made a moment ago. So next slide. I'll grab my stuff. 3 years ago, Catherine Hayhoe, who is an amazing woman. I share with you her biography because I so admire her. I got a chance to meet her 2 years ago at a conference at Goshen College. Catherine got a bachelor's in astrophysics. She then got a master's in meteorology and a PhD in climate. I've often seen her name on climate articles. She then went on to study political science, and I've heard she has a PhD in that, but I can't believe that. That's just incredible. Who knows? She's a humble person. Her husband is an evangelical minister. Catherine gets into fundamentalist and evangelical churches. She's accepted as a woman to come and talk as a climate scientist. It's amazing. She absolutely speaks honestly about her Christian faith. Most of her communication up until this particular recent book has been about the weather. She's well known for a podcast series called Global Weirding. She's had a tremendous footprint. United Nations giving her awards. She's now the chief scientist at Nature Conservancy. Saving us, as she talked about the book when she was here, would be a departure. She was no longer going to make science the key. Rather, it was going to be filled with stories about herself, learning what she has about the climate, and about lots of conversations she's had with others to try to get them to think about how they could get involved, how they could contribute, where they could maybe plug in like a scuba diver talking to his scuba diving club. Bits and pieces of science as you read, but it's a very powerful book. She's taking a different tact. And so, next slide. Why do we do that? Well, I remember when Greta Thunberg jumped on the scene. I can't even remember when it was, and I didn't look it up. One of the things she used to say was, we've just got to listen to the scientists. They know what's really happening, and there aren't enough people in this world who are doing that. Recently, she was interviewed by someone in the New York Times where she wasn't quite so optimistic that that's the way to go. Communicating the science is maybe not the way to go, directly and first. So why might that be true? Well, first of all, we need to be aware that for every science right now, if I can get my lovely notes since everything fell on the floor, sorry. All science communicators are facing credibility challenges tied to perceptions of whether or not they're really politically neutral and objective. Can we really trust universities? Aren't they funded by big business? Scientists are invested in changing policy. Doesn't that make them biased towards supporting particular policies? Further, aren't most scientists liberal? Then their communication will be biased, right? I couldn't believe it. Last semester, for the first time in my life, I dove into a whole new field, which is called the science of climate change communication. It is, as Jocelyn's world, it's a social science with political scientists, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, and a number of the sub-disciplines, all publishing and writing. I was overwhelmed. I had no idea there were that many articles. I couldn't possibly read all the material in such new areas as risk awareness, motivated reasoning. When a person who's had certain dearly held prior beliefs is not going to let new information move those beliefs aside, like science, no matter how factual, no matter how well communicated or whatever else. Lots of other areas as well. So what else is happening? Climate in itself has a challenge because it is so abstract. If we go outside tonight, we're just going to talk about the weather, really, right? You know, it's kind of warm right now, that darn snowstorm that I so loved. I hope some of you did too. It was so wonderful. The snow is melted. Well, that's a lot of weather. It's not really climate. I guess we could say February warming temperatures like this could be anomalous, but we don't really know. I don't know. I'm sure there could be some who do a big study. So it's tough to grasp, tough to measure. Second, most of you, I hope, know this. If you don't, I think you should. Since the early 1990s, there has been a major campaign paid for, by the fossil fuel industry to sow disinformation, to sow confusion. So often the media began to say, well, you know, we're going to hear from this scientist over here who's at the University of Nebraska, but then we need some balance. So we'll be hearing from a person over here. They may not be a scientist, but they don't think climate change or global warming is real, whichever term they want to use. So they've helped create a lot of confusion. Naomi Oreskes is an historian of science now teaching at Harvard. Her book, Merchants of Doubt, became a movie. Perhaps some of you saw it. It was here at the Ross 5 years ago, maybe. Very powerful movie. And it's easier to see the movie, frankly, than to read the book. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was sitting 2 seats away from Jeff Fortenberry. Decided not to say anything. I hadn't really met him at that point. He watched it very, very closely. And when he saw the part about a House of Representatives guy very, very close to him, who was primaried in South Carolina because he really talked about the warming climate. That was one of the reasons. I'm sure there were others. He would actually sat forward in his seat and kept himself very, very close to the situation. And yet every time I talked to Jeff personally, I was there twice, we had a nice relationship. I'd ask him if he ever planned to talk about climate change. No. This isn't the time to do that. It's much too controversial. No, we can't do that. So there was the movie Merchants of Doubt. He was seeing it. He understood it. He knew that. No other field of science has, except for cigarette smoking. And she linked the two. Finally, increasing moral tribalism. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight. Next slide. What I learned last semester, totally new to me. I studied ethics when I was in divinity school. In fact, I was even on a group of people at the divinity school who got asked to start the first class in business ethics that Harvard Business School had had since 1952, which was the year I was born. So I got involved with that whole project. And what were we doing? We were looking at moral arguments. Are we going to support this policy or that policy? What kind of argument are we going to be making? Are we going to be making a utilitarian argument, the greatest good for the greatest number? Or are we going to be making what is called a deontological argument from Kant on values or virtues that would not involve any kind of calculus? We were teaching students at the business school about that instead of what might have been more important. All along, other people, other scholars were looking at morality. And here's what I learned. Starting with the work of an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist about 20 years ago, this gentleman studying cultures all over the world chimpanzee and bonobo community work activities, as well as people here, identified 5 psychological systems. She's not worried about moral arguments, psychological systems of what really makes people tick morally. The first are 2 that we would put with the ethics of autonomy. And that's what most liberals are drawn to. Basically, what we're talking about there, let's see if I can find it here. Liberals participate in a moral world framed by justice, fairness, equality, and victimization. No policy, no law should inhibit the autonomy and free expression of the individual. Now, when we're thinking about climate, that may seem a bit strange because we're thinking about communities and we're thinking about whole regions and how they would be affected by the changes. But if you think about all the positions that many of us have who call ourselves liberal, we really are thinking that way. Let me give you an example. Suppose you had a neighbor who put up a large sign in his front yard that says, "Gay marriage will destroy society." You ask him to explain the sign, and he replies, "Homosexuality is an abomination to God. Gay marriage will undermine marriage, the institution upon which our society rests." Now you ask your neighbor to explain how allowing 2 people to marry who are in love and of the same sex will harm other marriages. He changes the subject. So the liberal, if you will, is really concerned that each person have a chance. If they've loved somebody of the same sex, or if they are beginning to realize that they really no longer belong in a body of a certain original sex at their birth, they need to be supported on that journey. But that's not the way a traditional conservative would necessarily think. The challenge is that these anthropologists discovered conservatives use all 5 of those psychological systems. Harm, care, which we'll look at in a few minutes in a practical example, fairness and justice, and then the ethics of community and divinity. In-group loyalty, where patriotism and heroism are sacrosanct, authority and respect, and purity and sanctity, which is more in the realm of the divinity. Now, the anthropologist who wrote this, I requested that article 2 weeks ago. Friends, I got it today. I thought, really? Today? I'm giving the paper tonight. I ran into a room in my house and just tried to plow through it, but it's going to take a lot longer. Supposedly, these anthropologists did a whole series of interviews and surveying of a population in India, where Davim and Jagridi live, not necessarily in their location. But their ideas came out of that rich cauldron of data, as well as looking at other Western cultures, etc. So let's see if we can understand what those other categories are for conservatives. First of all, we need to realize exactly how do conservatives operate. Renowned political theorist Samuel Huntington argued that conservatism is best understood not as an inherent theory in defense of particular institutions, but as a positional ideology. I kept seeing that comment as I would read things. What is a positional ideology? Well, I finally got a Harrington article from Interlibrary Loan several days ago. Rather than representing the self-satisfied and complacent acceptance of the institutional status quo, ideological conservatism arises from the anxiety that valuable institutions are endangered by contemporary developments or by proposed reforms. Think of how the man argued. Homosexual marriage threatens marriage. It is an institution that now exists. It does not need reform. We need to protect it and fight for it. That's just not the way many other people would think. So let's again look more closely at these ideas. Looking back at the particular people I've just discovered, whose work I've recently discovered as of today, that finally got to my desk. The ethic of community that we're talking about here sees the world not as a collection of individuals, but as a collection of institutions, families, tribes, guilds, or groups. The purpose of moral regulation is to protect the moral integrity of the various stations or roles that constitute a society of community, where a society or community is conceived of as a corporate entity with an identity, standing, history, and reputation of its own. So what are the values or virtues that rise to the top? Duty, respect, loyalty, and interdependence. So there you have in-group loyalty. We need to be close. The tribalism that we've begun to realize is happening. We need to stay close with people who are like us. When I discussed the destruction of the Miller home on Woods Crest Avenue, that all of us know about and no doubt have opinions about, with a very dear friend whom I've known since we were 8, who, unlike me, is a very staunch Republican, struggling a bit now with where things have gone. But nonetheless, that's been who she is, and I respect her for that. And when I talked to her about it, I've been pondering the first words out of her mouth. I grew up close by to that, or a big chunk of my life, and I knew Mrs. Miller. She was quite a character, but that's another torch paper. My friend's first words were these: I cannot believe the president of Huddle has torn it down. Does he not have any respect? And I thought, respect? Now, maybe I'm picking at a little word and being too literalistic and distracting myself or the rest of you. But why would she say that? I immediately said, well, of course, they do have a right to do that in Nebraska. We don't have laws that govern it. I thought we did, but I talked with the various historians who advised the country club development organization, or whatever it was called, the historical preservation group. But she talked about respect. So as I've been reading this material, I realized that's right in the nexus of key values that are very important. So that, as one theorist said, if someone sees a sign that's encouraging people to protest, that may not be at all what they would approve of, because protesting is disrespectful. I thought of the fact that at the recent American Guild, I'm sorry, wrong name, American Geophysical Union, which is the largest organization of earth scientists in the world, their most recent meeting, there were 2 scientists who made a decision to do something out of the ordinary. Supposedly, they held a grief group somewhere near the registration division to talk about how rough it is with climate changes. And they were asked to leave after a while. It perhaps was disruptive. I'm not sure. But then they showed up at a particular gathering where people were looking at art and climate change. And I'm not sure how that was working exactly at that place. But they went there and unfurled a protest banner, which said, "This is an emergency. We all know how serious it is. And we need to start acting in ways we have not," or something to that effect. Well, supposedly they were removed from the gathering. They were forbidden to go back to the meeting, and their research was taken away from the group. It was expunged. It's caused a bit of a stir in parts of the climate movement around the country. And Senator Merkley, the senator from Oregon, who often is at the forefront of climate legislation and work, supposedly wrote a letter to the AGU president asking about this decision. But I thought to myself, The AGU involved scientists from all over the world. And for some of them, active dissent or activity like that would be a kind of slap in the face of an organization like that might not at all be taken well. They could still do it, of course, and maybe it was good that they did. But beginning to familiarize myself with these very different kinds of psychological understandings and the virtues and values that they would support has just gotten me to do a lot of thinking. I share one other quick anecdote before two other things, and then I end up. If I can find where I was, I keep losing my place. It's lovely. Here we go. So once again, how does this work? Well, two of the authors who talk a lot about these lovely anthropologists, I use their work as a secondary source, had this story to tell, which I think would be interesting to all of us. If I can find it. In the July 25th, 2005 episode of The Daily Show, liberal host Jon Stewart tried in vain to convince conservative US Senator Rick Santorum that banning gay marriage was an injustice. Quickly realizing the futility of this effort, Stewart remarked, "It is so funny. You know, what's so interesting about this is ultimately you end up getting to this point, this crazy stopping point where literally we can't get any further. I don't think you're a bad dude. I don't think I'm a bad dude, but I literally can't convince you." The stopping point Stewart felt was the invisible wall separating liberal and conservative moralities. Santorum's anti-gay marriage views were based on concerns for, again, traditional family structures, and then biblical authority and moral disgust for homosexual acts. Purity and sanctity is something that we don't really deal with in our country, but the anthropologist did talk a lot about that in India and how Hinduism operates in that culture or those cultures. He was disgusted by those acts and did not want to go further. All right, so how does this all apply to climate and environmental communication? Well, I've seen lots and lots of studies in the literature that I've begun to read. And one of them was very interesting. It didn't really talk about climate change as a variable per se. It more looked at pollution. But 308 participants were recruited for a study testing the harm care understanding of values versus purity sanctity. And then there was a neutral message condition. Participants in the harm care and purity sanctity conditions read a persuasive message modeled after a newspaper op-ed. These messages utilized words typical of their respective moral domain. The purity sanctity pictures then showed a cloud of pollution looming over a city, a person drinking contaminated water, a forest covered in garbage. The harm care pictures showed a destroyed forest of tree stumps, a barren coral reef, and cracked lands suffering from drought. Importantly, both messages ended positively, providing information regarding what people could do. The conservative respondents, as they identify themselves, did become more open to supporting the environmental message. So many of these writers are trying to suggest that if we message differently, we may be able to make an impact. So I put on your table a particular part of the National Interfaith Power and Light Voter Action Guide. Edison called my attention to it in 2022, and I decided to read it. So let's put it back up here, and I put it in front of you. Mark's suggestion was so you all could read it better, because it's awful hard to read here. Let's just take a quick look at this, and then I will end. As people of faith and conscience, our values call us to be good stewards of creation. This, by the way, is the first of 5 or 6 issues that are profiled in this voter guide, which anyone could order in any church, synagogue, or mosque or temple connected through Interfaith Power and Light. As people of faith and conscience, our values call us to be good stewards of creation. I think that could work with all 5 domains. But climate change is destroying our common home, harming our communities, definitely harm care, especially the most vulnerable. That's right in the midst of the liberal autonomy values, which again, conservatives do share, but they balance it with these other parts that are part of these other sensitivities. Putting future generations at risk, my eye thought maybe that could go first before you talk about the vulnerability, which does move my heart and others no doubt as well. But the future generations at risk might reach out to the other side. I'm just guessing. You can all throw tomatoes at me if you think I'm crazy, and that's fine. From historic wildfires to record-breaking extreme weather to air pollution, climate change is devastating our health and destroying our environment. That could begin to work with the purity folks in the last portion of those values. Climate impacts are being experienced by everyone, regardless of zip code or political affiliation. You get the point. What this has done for me is made me start thinking, how can we message in ways that will be inclusive? Some things we're just not going to agree on. As Jon Stewart so powerfully indicated when he rather humbly pointed out that he just couldn't convince Santorum. But we should be able to do better with environmental processes and also climate change. So I leave you with these final words. As all the activists in Interfaith Power and Light were gathering together to celebrate the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which, as we know, was really a climate bill. If I can find it, where is it? One of our best leaders, who is the director of Interfaith Power and Light in Northern Virginia, in Maryland, and DC, who's an active Jewish layperson, read us this story. I want to close us out with a teaching from the Jewish tradition, from a Rabbi Simcha Bunim, who teaches, every person should have two pockets. In one pocket should be a piece of paper saying, I am only dust and ashes. In the other pocket should be a piece of paper saying, for my sake was the world created. Sometimes we need to remind ourselves of one, and sometimes of the other. They are both true at the same time. Every person should have two pockets. I have long felt as a climate activist, working on the ground in faith communities day in and day out, that I too need to have two pockets. On one piece of paper is written, it's okay that building the movement we need will take time. We need to take the time to listen, to build trust, to connect across difference, to unwind generations of harm and exploitation. We need to take the time necessary to till and sow. And on the other piece of paper is written, this is an emergency. Pull every fire alarm. Wake everyone up. There is no time left to protect our neighbors and our world from catastrophe. As climate activists, as everyone in this room, we have to live in the tension between those two, between the simultaneous necessity of speeding up and slowing down. Every person should have two pockets. Thank you.
Questions?
Now, come on, guys, I invited you here because I know you can talk. Martha.
I have a question that you have answered with this, the five, whatever areas, whatever it was.
Should we put them back up again, the five?
Yeah, the chart.
Psychological.
Yeah.
Going back up again.
I usually don't have any problem with answering a question about what I believe, because it's always pretty clear cut. And then I ran across a poll on Facebook that said, do you support active picketing in front of somebody else's, in front of somebody else's house? And I couldn't answer that.
Yeah, there it is.
And it's because of the in-group loyalty and authority, respect, and purity and sanctity. That's why I couldn't answer it.
Wow.
I still can't.
Any response there before I start?
No, go ahead.
I understand. So in listening and coming to the end into the tribal concept of how we look at decisions, how we make decisions, how we work out of two pockets, not just the United States, but the world has so many distractions. Like in the United States, we have gun issues, we have violence. So we are constantly flipping our head back and forth to all the different things that we need to pay attention to. So when you're presenting communication like this, which is life-saving, and for the future, for the next generations, it's imperative that we pay attention to it and play out of two pockets appropriately and strategically. But how do you weigh and communicate as a minister, as a person, as a humanitarian, as a scientist, when the distraction is so dynamic consistently from one urgency to another?
It's so tough for all of us. So many of us here who are activists by nature. We have to keep ourselves active on, I think, many things at once. The deal with climate changes, though, I guess I always go back to thinking about it. I see it as kind of the granddaddy of it all, if you will. I love, Tim is a great scholar of Neihardt. So to think of grandfather, the grandfather reality, there's just, I mean, even if we don't get the LGBTQ plus situation working out well, even if I hope we can do better with guns. It's so crazy. My nephew teaches at Michigan State. We were all, of course, as would any of us, be very worried. Is he okay? And he was. But he's struggling now with what to do with his students. Some of them are, of course, so very upset. It's the granddaddy of them all. So I think, okay, now what's really going to help people get excited to make those calls or write those quick emails? I made a decision myself in January. I'm busy. I have resigned a couple of things, thank goodness, so I could do better in Rachel's class. I would like to, and other things. I'm going to start advocating again. I really care about it, and I feel I need to do that. So if we can't get climate right, you know, we've got to make that good news happen that New York Times, I think it was, no, Washington Post reporter documented. It may not be as bad, but we've got to make sure the solar installations get in there. The batteries can be devised. I had a great talk. I'd love to bring him here to all of you. He's an engineering student at the university, working with batteries for wind power. There's still a lot of problems. I don't remember all that he said. We've got to do that. We have no choice. So I guess I think about that. But all of us are going to have to be on lots of different places. You're right, Sandy. We can't just ignore it. All the other things you mentioned.
It's all important. Thank you. Great.
Do we have an understanding of the wild changes in climate before the Anthropocene?
Well, let's see. Are you talking about the Younger Dryas, maybe, or a couple of periods where there were rapid changes? Is that what you're thinking about, or? Okay, I worked on a big paper on the Bowling Alrod warm period, and what I discovered was that's about 12,000 to 14,000 years before the present, so it's right around the time of the Holocene beginning. We're mistaken about a lot of that happened. in this last period, since the last glacial maximum. There are a lot of things that change in the climate that we think we know, but I think we're finding we have some real problems with. So I'm not sure what you're saying, meaning by wild changes. The Younger Dryas was a very rapid cooling period. I don't know that much about it, maybe Les or some of the rest of you do. Bob or Rachel, I don't know, but I'm not sure what you mean by wild changes.
Well, we have ice ages and we have tropics.
Well, Earth has had, I know enough about paleoclimate to say Earth has had about 4 major ice ages, and we just came out of one. The last glacial maximum was about 26,000 years before the present. And then we moved into a pretty even climate. And part of the difficulty we all have is, if you will, I quote somebody I teach ESL, and I just taught the students about Goldilocks. We've had kind of a Goldilocks climate for quite a number of years, just right. And it's an anomaly. You know, we just haven't seen that in big chunks of Earth history, to my knowledge, but I am not a good student of paleoclimate, so I should shut up. Karen, are you there? She's a better geologist than I am. Maybe she can speak. Karen. Maybe she went away.
So Penny, I like the whole chart that you had between the different sets of values, but I wonder, is that enough to go and look just, you know, liberal, conservative? I think one of the things I've really seen is just the stratification between, you know, the subgroups within that. The more, you know, progressive liberals, the more moderated liberals, the more moderate conservatives versus, you know, kind of the Tea Party, Trumper conservatives. And those values shift, especially like I think about the, you know, really targeted conservatives who, for them, it's all about radical individuality.
That's a good point. I did think about that as I was reading. Most of the stuff I read is somewhat dated. The most recent article I read was written in 2019 that was dealing with motivated reasoning. That's where I found a lot of the material about what's happening to science. Lots of studies about how it is that scientists are being treated and understood, et cetera. But a lot of this other material is pretty dated. So I wonder if, as you're suggesting, if there aren't better theorists who are really seeing the greater complexity of these kind of categories. These come from anthropologists who are doing this massive sweep, as I said, across cultures, bonobos, monkeys, humans, and I maybe didn't make it clear. Conservatives have all 5, but they hear us, or some of us, with the first 2, and the more polarization, maybe the more they're kind of, well, I don't know, I also care about this and this and this. But you're right, Edison, a lot more work needs to be done. But it's just gotten me to begin to think about how people communicate, what really matters to them. So I love the 2 examples about the homosexuality and, you know, why are people so adamant against trans people right now? I mean, they're just really, really upset. There's so many bills in so many legislatures. What's going on? Well, maybe it's partly the purity, sanctity kinds of values that we don't necessarily pay that much attention to. Again, I don't know how much that helps us with the climate and environmental communication. I just found that one study, but your point is well taken.
Okay, so I have 2 quick things. One, on top of the liberal conservative, I think that we also have those who have less, probably are struggling just to make ends meet and don't have the energy or the resources to care as much about climate. 2, I wonder if in your discussion, in your readings, that the great pause during COVID, when we all could breathe clean air and nobody was driving for like a year and a half, 2 years, if that is made, if there's any documented impact on the trajectory of the climate with the great pause, whether that made a difference or not, and what can we learn from that?
I wish it had, Denise. It didn't. Believe it or not. emissions kept rising. I'm serious. There was a lull, and I guess 3 to 4 months, maybe some of you who are better statistical people than I am, but the numbers still continued to rise after 2020 ended, 2021. Maybe not as rapidly, I'm not sure, Denise, but I looked for that like you. I wanted to see evidence. It was just a brief pause.
Penny, I thought that was really a great presentation.
Thank you.
My question kind of goes along this divide that we have in the country between liberals and conservatives. Historically, the left has been against nuclear power. Okay. I'm wondering, number one, is that changed with the new generation of nuke plants, smaller nuke plants? I'm not an expert on any of this, but I know that there's a lot of scientists and a lot of different people that are saying that we are going to have a nuclear component to fix this thing. Okay.
Well,
So what the groups that you're with are people on the left still against?
I am going to call on my dear friend Edison McDonald, who is a solar power expert who probably follows it more closely than I. I know that the executive director of Interfaith Power and Light still thinks they're too costly, even if they're scaled down. But Edison, you're a scholar.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I'd say it's definitely shifting. There are a couple of new groups, especially a group called Generation Atomic that's really been focusing on younger folks who are interested in nuclear energy as part of the transition. And I think especially as we're having conversations about like OPPD and LES as they're transitioning and saying we still need to have some on-demand sort of power. But yeah, the conversation around nuclear is really transitioning, especially because our current natural resource chair in the legislature is married to a nuclear lobbyist. So I think we're going to see some shifts there soon.
Thank you, Edison. See, we need some better people on the ground, Steve. No, John has the question.
Thanks for that presentation, Penny. Hello, there we are. Not sure I need this thing. There we go. All of my people are rednecks, and I guess that makes me a card-carrying redneck myself. And we have an ample supply here in Nebraska. And of rednecks, yes, ma'am. And I think there's a certain directness that's appreciated in these quotas. For instance, one kind of directness would be to ask who profits from the continuation of the things that are causing climate change. And that would be the fossil fuel industry. And their representatives in government, direct and indirect. Joe Manchin is a coal man, owns a coal company. And a lot of people take quote unquote campaign contributions from oil and gas and coal companies. So I think you can't shy away too far from the fact that there's a lot more money promoting the old dirty ways of destroying the climate we knew, and a lot less money coming from the industries like solar and wind, which, by the way, have been for a number of years now cheaper.
Well, two quick responses. First of all, I don't know it yet. I know that Interfaith Power and Light is going to try to have a webinar on the Inflation Reduction Act. So exactly how is that going to help solar and wind and other alternative energies. I don't know, maybe Edison or some of the rest of you know more than I do. And I think the other thing we have to be aware of, because of the war in Ukraine, because of what has happened in other parts of Europe, Germany is bringing back coal plants themselves. I don't think it's necessarily any part of their fossil fuel industrial infrastructure who's been leading the way there. The country is terrified, if it can no longer rely on the gas from Russia, of what to do. So you all probably know Greta Thunberg was there and was arrested. She was trying to protest, as with others there in the country 2 weeks ago or so. So it's tough right now. You're right, John. We have to call it as it is, and also be aware of that additional very sad and unfortunate and terrible detail. Yep. There you go,
Hi.
Jocelyn.
So your list of 5 things felt very much like Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory.
He's the guy.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, yeah,
He's one of them. Right.
okay,
Drawing
okay.
upon that other anthropologist. Yeah.
Perfect. And so my question is, within that moral foundations theory, have you found anything that supports that, like the harm care or in grouping and out grouping is very specific to the people within the in grouping and out grouping? So if you were identifying a family system, and so I'm concerned about harm care, but specifically for only people that I care about. Have you found anything like that? But then also understanding that movies like Fern Gully and even Bambi, where it's like we see these things are happening. I hope that doesn't affect me specifically, so I can't worry about that. Or also, I mean, we saw with like Hurricane Katrina and Flint with water and that type of thing. There are these natural disasters that are taking place, and yet there still seems to be a sense of non-urgency, for lack of a better term in my mind right now. But there seems to be like that's still not enough to evoke concern across the board. So have you found anything that supports that it is specific to in grouping within like my personal community or the people that I care about, but then also if harm care and all of these other things that are supported are
they
not
going to sway the balance? I guess
exactly.
you'd say.
Thanks.
I don't know it well enough yet, Jocelyn. You probably know it far better than I do. I'm just beginning to read it and understand it. So I wouldn't want to answer that in any kind of academic way because I wouldn't do it justice. I guess I think if harm care is strong enough in a person, that can overpower in-group loyalty kinds of issues, concerns, or considerations. I mean, as a pastor, I just assume that harm care is going to be dominant when people listen to, we spent 2 weeks dealing with Turkey and Syria in our church. I don't know how many people responded, but it's just terrible. And they had another earthquake today. That's obviously an aftershock, presumably. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't know that. Haven't seen the results, and I'm not a good earthquake person at all. So I hope the harm care can override, and it can. The 5 are together for the conservatives. That was what was so interesting to me. But it's just that I think so many of us disregard the others. At least I have, until I came upon it. So I wouldn't want to answer you more academically. I don't know it well enough yet. But if any of you want to read it with me, boy, I'm dying to get into what those anthropologists wrote, and then we'll take what Edison just asked and try to find more recent theorists who are really wrestling with it more helpfully in the weeds. Yes, to agree.
Thank you for the presentation, Penny. I just wanted to ask, what could be the role of religious beliefs in climate change, and how can these be linked with liberalism and conservatism?
Well, obviously, for liberal Christians like myself, it's very important, and that comes with harm care and also justice. That's a big part of who I am as a Christian, as I understand it. For the people of India who are devout Hindus, from what I was reading, and maybe you could help me with that since you know far more than I do, the whole understanding of purity, sanctity may be the most important part of one's faith. But I wouldn't know that personally. I'm just beginning to try to understand that. As I listened and thought about the story with Rick Santorum and Jon Stewart, just a small dialogue that was part of one of the hate articles that I read, I think there certainly are beliefs that would put a person back into worrying about the community. And again, the institutions that the faith is supposed to help guard, shall we say. And that's a balance that people would have in my part of Christianity as well as the other part, but we're probably going to express it differently as to what that's going to mean. So I think it depends, and that's a terrible answer. So I'll try to do better on the car as we drive home. Yes, Les.
Well, just some comment, excuse me, just some comments. Mark Twain had interesting comments on weather and climate. He said, climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. And both of these involve probability, which is something that people, which is math, which is something people don't do that well with. And global warming involves heat and temperature. And this is physics. And the vast majority of people have not had physics, so which makes it difficult for them to fully grasp. And the climate change, I mean, that's basically calculus, which is again something people don't do all that well with. And another
But
thing,
hopefully they could read the graph, the exponential rise of it anyway. Even if they don't know the formula, but go ahead.
well, another problem, a difficulty is that in the past, climate change has been relatively slow. So the environment has had a chance to evolve. Here it's occurring very rapidly. So our vegetation, animals, vegetables are not going to have time to evolve to take account the change.
Thank you, Les. Yes.
I've been out of teaching for quite a while now. The youth of today, are they who we're going to be looking to? Because most of us won't be around for those youngest people to.
And I'm
Come
going
along,
to turn
and
to
I-
Sam Segrist, who's going to
Okay.
answer that question.
Good.
Who teaches?
Yeah, how about the youth of today?
I'm going to reference someone who I've been working with high school youth for 15 years. And before that, I was working with some college students. And my professor said that she used to have, when she did a kind of a climate and ethics, it was like the rhetoric of environmentalism course. When she first started teaching the class in the 90s, she had to spend the first couple weeks trying to address the things that when you were referencing Senator Har with like, no, it's real, it's bad, it's us, you know. She used to have to spend several weeks trying to really break the students down from certain things that maybe the confusion and doubt that was sown in their mind. And then something happened where the first day when she would do her normal, like, okay, climate change, is it real? Or, you know, what do you think about this issue? And overwhelmingly, over 95% of the students are like, oh yeah, we all know it's real and it's happening. And she realized she had to redo her syllabus because she didn't have to spend as much time convincing them of what was happening. And I think, generally, I think more young people are on board with understanding this is an existential threat, but they are also very upset with the older generation for continuing to vote for candidates that or basically are not doing anything about it. So I would say the kids are all right, but they're having a lot of anxiety, having dealt with COVID and everything, like we all have, but they're at a more developmental stage. So that was a long-winded answer, but I do think young people are more like, they see a TikTok about it and they go, oh my God, and they get it. So.
Well, it's been great. Thank you all for participating.